Part 1. The Scream That Changed Everything. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely grip the wrench Papa Will had placed in them. It was June 15th, 1952, and I was 11 years old standing in his garage on what I thought would be just another ordinary summer evening in Millbrook, Indiana. The air was thick with humidity and the familiar smell of motor oil that had always made me feel safe before everything changed in 17 minutes. That would haunt me for the next 7 years. "Now, Maggie girl," Papa Will said, his voice different, somehow lower, with an edge I'd never heard before. "Papa Will is going to teach you something very special tonight. Something just between us." Every instinct in my young body screamed danger, though I couldn't understand why. This was my grandfather William, Papa Will Thompson, the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who carved wooden animals for me when I was sick, who was beloved by everyone in our small town of 2,847 people. Yet something primitive and protective inside me recoiled from the way he was looking at me now, like I was prey instead of his cherished granddaughter. "I don't think I want to learn anything else today," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the thundering of my own heartbeat. "Can I please go back to the house? Mama will be wondering where I am." His smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold in a way that made my skin crawl. "Now, sweetheart," he said, and the way he spoke that word, the same endearment he would whisper during the worst moments of what came next. "You wouldn't want to disappoint Papa Will after all the kindness I've shown you, would you?" What followed was 17 minutes that shattered my childhood into pieces I would spend years learning to reassemble. I know it was exactly 17 minutes because I was staring at the clock on his workbench the entire time, watching the hands move while my world collapsed around me. When I screamed, and I did scream with every ounce of strength in my small body, the sound echoed off the oil-stained walls and died there, swallowed by a building that seemed complicit in keeping secrets. "Hush now, Maggie girl," he whispered afterward, his gentle hands helping me fix my torn dress as if he were comforting me rather than being the cause of my terror. "This is our special secret just between Papa Will and his favorite granddaughter. You understand why it has to be private, don't you?" Through my tears and shock, I somehow managed to nod, though I understood nothing except that something fundamental had been destroyed inside me. "Good girl," he continued, his voice returning to the grandfatherly tone that everyone in town found so warm and reassuring. "Because if you ever told anyone about our special time together, they wouldn't believe you. A man like me with my reputation in this community against a little girl's confused stories, they'd think you were sick in the head, sweetheart. They might even send you away to one of those hospitals for troubled children." Even at 11, I understood the mathematics of 1952 small-town life. Papa Will had spent 30 years building his reputation as Thompson's auto repair owner, volunteer fire chief, decorated war veteran, and the man who never charged widows for fixing their cars. He organized the 4th of July parade every year, coached Little League baseball, and served on the church board. I was just William Thompson's quiet granddaughter, a dreamy child who read too many books and sometimes told elaborate stories about the fictional worlds I inhabited. Who would believe me? More terrifyingly, what would happen to my family if I tried to make them believe me? "Besides," Papa Will said, pressing a peppermint candy into my shaking palm, "you wouldn't want to hurt your mama and daddy. Would you break up this beautiful family over something they could never understand? Some secrets are too precious to share, Maggie girl. This is one of them." As he walked me back to our house, his arm around my shoulders like nothing had happened, I felt something inside me break that would take years to heal. But what Papa Will didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that along with the innocence he had destroyed, he had also awakened something else. Something my grandmother Clara had recognized in me before she died when I was 8, something she had called my special strength that lived deep inside me, waiting for the moment when I would need it most. I just didn't know that moment wouldn't come for 7 years. My name is Margaret Rose Thompson, though everyone called me Maggie then. This is the story of how I survived what should have destroyed me, and how I learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon against evil is simply refusing to stay silent forever. It's about discovering that the strength to overcome unspeakable darkness can be inherited like eye color or musical ability passed down from one generation to the next, by women who understood that survival sometimes requires patience, planning, and a voice that refuses to be silenced no matter how long it takes to find the courage to use it. This is my story. It's also my grandmother's story, though it took me years to understand that connection. And it's the story of every child who has ever been told to keep secrets that were never theirs to keep. Part 2. The Perfect Family, Facade. Maggie, come help me set the table for Sunday dinner. Mama's voice drifted from our sunny kitchen 3 days after that terrible evening in Papa Will's garage. Her tone was bright and cheerful, completely unaware that her eldest daughter had been fundamentally changed in ways she couldn't see. I walked through our house on legs that still felt unsteady, everything looking exactly the same as it had before the yellow gingham curtains. Mama had sewn herself the ceramic rooster collection lined up on the windowsill, the family portrait showing all of us smiling at last year's church picnic. But I felt like I was seeing it all through thick glass, separated from the normal world I used to inhabit by secrets too dangerous to share. Our home was the picture of 1952 American prosperity, a 2-story white clapboard house with green shutters, complete with the picket fence and vegetable garden that magazines assured us were essential to happiness. Daddy ran Thompson's Auto Repair, the business he'd inherited from Papa Will 5 years earlier, working 16-hour days to maintain the reputation for excellence his father had built over 3 decades. Mama kept house with the fierce efficiency of a woman who'd grown up poor during the Depression and never wanted to feel helpless again. We were supposed to be the perfect family. From the outside, we probably looked like it. "You're awfully quiet today, honey," Mama observed as I mechanically placed our good china around the dining room table. "Are you feeling all right?" The question I would learn to dread above all others. How do you explain to your mother that you're not all right, that you'll never be all right again, without destroying everything she believes about her family and her world? Just tired. I mumbled an excuse that would become as familiar as breathing over the next 7 years. "Well, you'll perk up when Papa Will arrives," she said, stirring something that smelled wonderful at the stove. "He's bringing strawberry ice cream for dessert. Isn't that thoughtful?" My stomach dropped to my feet. I hadn't known he was coming for dinner. The thought of sitting across from him at our family table pretending everything was normal, while his eyes held knowledge of what we'd shared in private, made me feel like I might be sick all over Mama's fresh-mopped floor. "Do I have to eat with everyone?" I asked desperately. "Maybe I could take my plate up to my room, work on that book report for school." Mama turned around with a small frown of concern. "Margaret Rose Thompson, what has gotten into you? Of course you'll eat with the family. Papa Will specifically asked if you'd be here tonight. He's so proud of how much you're growing up." The way she said "growing up" made me want to disappear entirely. If only she knew what Papa Will thought about my development. The front door opened with its familiar squeak, followed by Papa Will's booming voice filling our small house. "Where's my beautiful family?" Tommy, my 8-year-old brother, came racing from the living room where he'd been playing with his toy soldiers. Papa Will, did you bring us anything?" "Might have something special in my pocket for good children." Papa Will chuckled, producing wrapped peppermint sticks that made Tommy and 6-year-old Susan squeal with delight. When his eyes found me standing frozen by the dining table, his expression shifted in a way that only I could see, becoming more intense, more possessive, like he was examining something that belonged to him. To anyone watching it would look like normal, grandfatherly affection. But I could see the predatory satisfaction lurking behind his kind blue eyes. "Hello there, Maggie girl. he said, approaching me with arms outstretched for a hug I couldn't refuse, without raising questions I wasn't prepared to answer. "How's my favorite granddaughter today?" "Fine," I whispered as his arms encircled me, feeling his hands linger on my back in places they had no right to touch, pressing just hard enough to remind me of Tuesday evening. "That's my good girl," he murmured in my ear so quietly that only I could hear. "Always so well behaved. Papa Will appreciates that quality more than you know." The words sent ice water through my veins, but I forced myself to stand still until he released me and turned his charm toward my parents. Daddy emerged from his study rolling up blueprints for a garage expansion he was planning. "Evening, Papa. Perfect timing. Helen's made your favorite pot roast." "Oh, wonderful." Papa Will's voice returned to its public warmth. "Though I have to say the company is even better than the cooking. This family is my greatest blessing." We took our usual seats around the mahogany table that had belonged to Papa Will's mother, with him at the head like a benevolent king, presiding over his domain. I sat directly across from him, unable to avoid his gaze throughout the meal, no matter how hard I tried to focus on my plate. "So, Maggie," he said between bites of Mama's perfectly seasoned roast, "I was thinking we could work on that carburetor repair project tomorrow afternoon. Just the two of us, so you can really concentrate on learning the proper techniques without distractions." My fork clattered against my plate as my hands started shaking again. I promised Carol I'd go to the library with her tomorrow. We're working on a school project about famous women in history. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been thinking about researching strong women who had overcome impossible circumstances, wondering how they found the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Papa Will's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile never wavered. "The library can wait, sweetheart. Practical education is much more important than book learning for a young lady. Besides, I've already cleared my entire afternoon specifically for your instruction." The way he said instruction made my skin crawl. "But Papa Will," I started to protest, desperation making me bolder than was probably safe. "Can you—" Daddy interrupted with gentle reproach. "Papa Will is taking valuable time out of his busy schedule to teach you skills most girls your age never get to learn. You should be grateful for his personal attention." Grateful. The word felt like poison in my throat. "That's quite all right, Robert," Papa Will said with magnanimous understanding. "Maggie's just excited about her schoolwork, which shows real dedication to learning. We'll find time for our private lesson very soon." The way he emphasized private lesson made me want to run from the room, but I forced myself to sit still and nod politely. While Tommy launched into an enthusiastic account of his baseball team's recent victory, Susan studied me with the uncomfortable perception that small children sometimes possess. "Why do you look scared, Maggie?" she asked with devastating directness. "Your face went all white when Papa Will was talking to you." Every adult eye at the table turned toward me, searching for explanations I couldn't provide without destroying the comfortable world they all inhabited. "I'm not scared," I said quickly, feeling Papa Will's gaze burning into my face. "Just thinking about that history project I mentioned." "What kind of project?" Mama asked with genuine maternal interest that made my deception feel even worse. I scrambled for details that would sound convincing. "About women who survived difficult situations and found ways to help other people. Like nurses in the war or teachers who helped children during hard times." It wasn't entirely fabricated. I had been thinking about women who had endured terrible circumstances and emerged with their strength intact, wondering if their examples might teach me something about survival. That sounds fascinating," Papa Will said, his tone perfectly grandfatherly despite the warning in his eyes. "Though I hope you're not getting unrealistic ideas about women who forgot their proper place in society. Some of those historical figures were quite unconventional in their behavior." The message was clear. Don't get ideas about fighting back or challenging authority. "Oh, I think it's wonderful that she's interested in strong women," Mama said with obvious pride. "Margaret has always been such a bright child. Takes after her grandmother Clara in that respect." A shadow passed across Papa Will's face, At the mention of his deceased wife so quickly, I almost missed it. Clara was indeed special, he said carefully. She understood the importance of family loyalty, of keeping private matters private where they belonged. Something in his tone made me look up sharply from my barely touched dinner. Was he talking about Grandma Clara keeping secrets too? But that seemed impossible. She had been the kindest, most honest person I'd ever known. Grandma Clara used to tell me stories. I said without thinking, remembering how she would hold my hand during her final illness and whisper about having inner strength that no one could take away. Papa Will's knuckles went white around his fork. Did she now? I don't recall Clara being much of a storyteller. Perhaps you're thinking of fairy tales from your books. But I wasn't thinking of fairy tales. I remembered distinctly how Grandma Clara would stroke my hair and talk about women in our family having special resilience that helped them survive difficult times. At 8 years old, I had thought she was just being encouraging to a shy granddaughter. Now I wondered if she had been trying to prepare me for something she saw coming. After dinner, while Mama and Susan cleared dishes and Daddy settled into his favorite chair with the evening paper, Papa Will cornered me in the living room where I was pretending to read Little Women. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock sharp," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone that brooked no argument. "Don't make me come looking for you, Maggie girl. That wouldn't be pleasant for either of us." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Good girl. And remember, our special time together is just between us. Family secrets are precious things that show how much we trust each other. You wouldn't want to betray that trust, would you?" "No, sir." I whispered the words, scraping my throat like broken glass. "That's what I like to hear. Papa Will knows he can count on his favorite granddaughter to be mature about these things." That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my safe, normal world had become a nightmare. My bedroom looked exactly the same, the pink wallpaper with dancing ballerinas that had always made me feel cheerful, the bookshelf overflowing with Nancy Drew mysteries and fairy tales, the window that looked out on our apple tree where I used to climb and dream about adventure. But I felt like a different person entirely, someone contaminated and broken in ways I couldn't even name. When I finally fell asleep near dawn, I dreamed about Grandma Clara sitting in her old rocking chair, trying to tell me something important. But every time she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out, as if even in dreams, some secrets were too dangerous to voice aloud. I woke up crying, though I couldn't remember why. Part 3. Learning the Rules of Survival. The second assault happened exactly as Papa Will had promised at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in his garage. This time, I knew what was coming, which somehow made it infinitely worse. The anticipation had been eating at me all day, making it impossible to concentrate on anything else, making me jump at every sound and flinch away from any adult's touch. "You look nervous, Maggie girl," Papa Will observed as he locked the garage door behind us with deliberate precision. "There's no need to be frightened. Papa Will would never hurt his special granddaughter." But he was hurting me, and we both knew it. As his hands began their terrible exploration, I discovered something that would become my primary survival mechanism over the next 7 years, the ability to separate from my body, to float somewhere above myself, and watch what was happening to that 11-year-old girl as if she were someone else entirely. "That's my good girl," he whispered, as I submitted without fighting, having learned that resistance only made things worse. "So mature for your age, so understanding of what real family love means, family love." The words felt like acid in my ears, but I had already learned that contradicting his version of reality was dangerous. He needed me to accept his interpretation of what was happening between us, needed me to believe that violation was affection and abuse was education. When it was over, He helped me straighten my clothes with the same gentle care he'd always shown, as if assault was just another form of grandfatherly attention. "You did very well today," he said, pressing a shiny quarter into my trembling palm. "Why don't you buy yourself something special at Woolworth's, a little reward for being such a good student?" I stared at the coin, understanding with horrible clarity that he was paying me for my silence. The quarter felt burning hot against my skin, like physical evidence of my complicity in something unspeakable. "I don't want anything," I whispered. "Of course you do, sweetheart," he replied with gentle firmness. "All little girls like treats, and you are still just a little girl, aren't you, Maggie? No matter how grown up our lessons make you feel." The reminder of my powerlessness was deliberate and devastating. I was a child in a world controlled by adults, dependent on their protection and approval for everything that mattered. Who would believe me if I spoke out? Who would choose my word over Papa Will's sterling reputation and decades of community service? Over the following months, a horrific routine established itself. Papa Will would create opportunities for us to be alone, offering to drive me to school activities, suggesting educational projects that required his specialized instruction, volunteering to babysit when my parents had social commitments. Each encounter followed the same pattern of violation and manipulation, with him constantly reinforcing the narrative that this was normal, that this was love, that this was our precious family secret. At school, my grades began slipping as concentration became impossible. Mrs. Patterson, my 6th-grade teacher, noticed the change immediately. "Margaret, you seem distracted lately," she said after class one day in October. "Is everything all right at home?" The question sent panic racing through me like wildfire. How could I explain that everything was wrong at home without revealing why? "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson," I said, automatically using the response I was learning to perfect. "Just tired, I guess. I've been staying up too late reading." She studied my face with the kind of professional concern that teachers develop after years of working with children. "Are you getting enough sleep, eating properly?" Sometimes, when a student's performance changes suddenly, it indicates problems that need adult attention. Adult attention was the last thing I wanted. Adults were dangerous. They asked questions I couldn't answer and made decisions that put me in more danger. "Really, I'm okay," I insisted, forcing brightness into my voice. "Maybe I've just been reading too many mystery novels at bedtime. Nancy Drew can be pretty exciting." Mrs. Patterson smiled at this explanation, accepting it as the kind of minor problem that could be easily solved with better time management. "Well, reading is wonderful, but make sure you're balancing it with proper rest. A bright girl like you shouldn't let her academic performance suffer." The conversation reminded me that maintaining the facade of normalcy was crucial for survival. Any deviation from expected behavior would invite scrutiny I couldn't afford. At home, my younger siblings began noticing changes in my behavior that were harder to explain away. "Why don't you want to play with us anymore?" Susan asked one evening when I declined to join a game of hide-and-seek that had once been my favorite. "You used to be fun, Maggie. Now you're always sad." The accusation hit like a physical blow. I had been fun once, hadn't I? Before Papa Will taught me that the world was full of dangers children couldn't understand or escape. "I'm getting too old for little kid games," I replied, using an excuse that Papa Will had suggested when he noticed my withdrawal from family activities. "Besides, I have homework to do. You're not that much older than us." Tommy protested with the logic of an 8-year-old. "Carol's sister Martha is in high school, and she still plays games with her family sometimes." Tommy's observation was uncomfortably accurate. At barely 12, I shouldn't be outgrowing childhood activities entirely. But normal development didn't apply to children carrying adult secrets. "Maybe later," I said, though we all knew later never came anymore. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my situation. I was surrounded by family who loved me, but I couldn't accept their love without feeling like I was deceiving them. How could I enjoy Mama's bedtime stories when I was hiding such terrible secrets? How could I laugh at Daddy's jokes when I was complicit in maintaining lies that would destroy him if he knew the truth? Christmas of 1952 was particularly difficult. Papa Will's gift to me was a delicate gold locket with a photograph of our whole family inside. "So you'll always keep your loved ones close to your heart," he said as he fastened the chain around my neck, his fingers lingering at my nape in a way that made my skin crawl with remembered violation. The locket felt like a collar, a physical reminder of bonds I couldn't break. But I had to smile and thank him while my parents looked on with approval at his thoughtful generosity. "Isn't Papa Will wonderful?" Mama whispered to me later that evening as we watched him help Tommy assemble a new model airplane. "He loves you children so much. We're so blessed to have him in our lives." Blessed. If only she knew what Papa Will's love actually looked like behind closed doors. That night, alone in my room, I made my first desperate attempt at seeking divine intervention. I knelt beside my bed and prayed with the intensity that only comes from true desperation, begging God to make Papa Will stop, to protect me from further harm, to send someone who would understand my situation and rescue me from it. But the next afternoon, Papa Will's hands were on me again in his basement workshop, and I understood with crushing finality that prayer wasn't going to save me. I was going to have to find a way to save myself, though I had no idea how a 12-year-old girl could fight back against a respected adult man with an entire community's worth of social protection. It was during that winter of despair that I made my first important discovery. While helping Mama organize some of Grandma Clara's belongings that had been stored in our attic, I found a small wooden jewelry box tucked behind Christmas decorations that hadn't been used since her death. "What's in here, Mama?" I asked, lifting the box carefully from its dusty hiding place. Mama glanced over from the trunk she was sorting through, her face softening with memory. "Oh, that's just some of your grandmother's personal things. Letters, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry I couldn't bear to throw away. I wasn't sure what to do with them." Inside the box, beneath faded photographs and costume jewelry, I found something that made my heart race with possibilities, a small leather journal with Clara Thompson written on the cover in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "Can I look at this, Mama?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my hands trembled with anticipation. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm sure Grandma Clara would want you to have it. She always said you reminded her of herself when she was young." That comment would prove more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. I smuggled the journal to my room that night and spent hours reading by flashlight under my blankets. What I discovered in those pages would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandmother, and most importantly, about myself. The journal entries dating back to the 1930s revealed that Grandma Clara had endured years of what she carefully described as Theodore's difficult moods and expectations that exceeded what a wife should be asked to provide. The language was circumspect, appropriate for a woman of her generation, but the meaning was unmistakable to someone who understood the reality behind euphemisms. Papa Will Theodore. William Thompson had been abusing his wife for decades. One entry dated March 1947 made me gasp aloud. "Little Margaret visited today. Such a bright, trusting child, she reminds me so much of myself at that age, before Theodore began his lessons about submission and family duty. I pray she stays innocent longer than I did, but I fear the patterns will repeat themselves. The women in this family seem to attract men who mistake our kindness for weakness, our love for invitation to take whatever they want." She had known. Somehow, 5 years before Papa Will laid a hand on me, Grandma Clara had anticipated what was coming and tried to prepare me for it. But the most crucial discovery came in her final entries written during the last months of her life. "Margaret has something I never possessed at her age, a core of strength that cannot be broken by cruelty or manipulation. When she discovers this inner resilience, nothing will be able to contain it. Not Theodore's reputation, not society's blindness, not even her own fear. I cannot protect her directly without making her situation worse, but I can leave her the tools she will need. The knowledge that she is not alone, that survival is possible, and that sometimes the strongest resistance involves appearing weak while secretly preparing for the moment when circumstances align for effective action. The women in our family carry something precious inside them, an inherited capacity for endurance that can outlast any darkness. Margaret will find her voice when the time is right, and when she does, the truth will finally set us all free. Reading those words felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, a roadmap left by someone who had traveled the same terrible territory and emerged with wisdom intact. Grandma Clara hadn't just endured Papa Will's abuse, she had studied it, understood it, and developed strategies for resistance that she was passing down to me through her journal. For the first time since that horrible evening in June, I felt something other than despair, hope. If Grandma Clara had survived Papa Will's cruelty for over 20 years while maintaining her essential humanity, then maybe I could do the same. Maybe there was something inside me that was stronger than his darkness. But more importantly, her journal gave me something concrete to hold on to when Papa Will's psychological manipulation made me doubt my own perceptions. Grandma Clara's careful documentation proved that his behavior followed established patterns, that I wasn't imagining or misinterpreting his actions. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't making it up, and I wasn't alone. The inherited resilience she had recognized in me was real, even if I couldn't feel it yet through the fog of trauma and fear. It was there waiting for the right moment to emerge, waiting for me to grow strong enough and wise enough to use it effectively. As I hid the journal beneath my mattress that first night, I made a silent promise to the grandmother I had loved but never truly understood I would survive this. I would find my voice when the time was right. And when I did, Papa Will's secrets would finally be exposed to the light that no darkness could contain forever. The inherited strength was awakening. I just had to be patient enough to let it grow. Part 4. The education continues. By the spring of 1953, Papa Will had begun what he called my advanced education, a systematic escalation of abuse that my parents not only permitted but actively encouraged as evidence of his dedication to my development. Maggie's showing such aptitude for practical learning, he told my parents during one of his frequent Sunday dinners. I think she's ready for more intensive instruction, individual tutoring sessions that will really challenge her abilities. Mama beamed with pride at this assessment. Isn't that wonderful, Margaret? Your own private instructor in subjects they don't teach at regular school? If only she knew what subjects Papa Will had in mind. The first official tutoring session took place on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I walked to Papa Will's house with legs that felt like lead, knowing that legitimizing our private time would embolden him to drop even more pretense about educational content. His basement had been prepared specifically for these sessions, a workspace cleared of tools, various mechanical devices arranged for demonstration purposes, and most disturbing of all, a small recording device positioned where it could capture everything that happened. "What's that for?" I asked, pointing at the machine with growing horror. "Documentation, of course," he replied as casually as if recording child abuse were standard educational practice. "Important lessons should be preserved for future reference. This way we can review your progress and identify areas that need additional attention." The implications terrified me. Not only was he planning to escalate his violations, but he was creating permanent records that could be used to control and manipulate me indefinitely. What followed was the worst assault yet, not just physically, but psychologically. Papa Will had clearly been planning this escalation for months, developing techniques designed to break down whatever resistance I had managed to maintain. "This is what mature women experience in loving relationships," he whispered while I sobbed beneath him. "This is your preparation for adult life, Maggie girl. Someday you'll thank Papa Will for providing such comprehensive education." When it was over, he played back portions of the recording while I lay trembling on his basement floor, too traumatized to move. Listen to how you sound," he said with clinical detachment. Anyone hearing this would understand that you're a willing participant in your own education. No one would ever believe you were being forced into anything against your will. The recording was devastating because it captured only sounds of compliance, my whispered agreements to his demands, my submission to his instructions. Without visual context, it sounded exactly like what he claimed evidence of willing participation rather than coerced victimization. I'm going to keep these recordings in a very safe place. He continued ejecting the tape and placing it in a small, locked box with several others. Just in case anyone ever questions the nature of our educational relationship. The threat was explicit. Any attempt to report his abuse would be countered with evidence that I had been an eager participant rather than an unwilling victim. That evening at dinner, my parents asked eagerly about my first official tutoring session. "How did it go, sweetheart?" Mama inquired with genuine interest. "Did you learn fascinating new things?" The question almost shattered what remained of my composure. How could I describe what I had actually learned about my own powerlessness, about the sophisticated techniques predators used to ensure their victims' silence, about the ways that love could be twisted into something monstrous? It was very educational. I managed to say the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Papa Will says you show exceptional aptitude for advanced instruction," Daddy added with obvious pride. "He thinks you might be ready for even more intensive sessions soon." More intensive. The phrase sent ice water through my veins, but I forced myself to nod and smile as if the prospect excited rather than terrified me. Meanwhile, at school, I was struggling to maintain even basic academic performance as trauma consumed more and more of my mental energy. Mrs. Patterson's concern deepened as my participation in class discussions dwindled to almost nothing. "Margaret, I'd like to speak with you after class," she said one Friday afternoon in May. "I'm worried about some changes I've been observing in your behavior and academic engagement." My stomach clenched with familiar panic, but I had no choice except to approach her desk when the other students had filed out for recess. "You were once one of my most enthusiastic students," she said gently, her eyes filled with the kind of professional compassion that made me want to tell her everything. "Lately, you seem distant, distracted, as if your mind is somewhere else entirely." The accuracy of her observation was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant someone had noticed my distress. Terrifying because adult attention inevitably led to questions I couldn't answer honestly. "I've just been tired lately," I said using my standard deflection. "Papa Will's been giving me extra instruction after school, and it's pretty intensive." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Papa Will, but not in the way I expected. Instead of the usual reverence that adults showed when discussing our town's most respected citizen, I caught a flicker of something that might have been concern. "What kind of instruction?" she asked carefully. The question caught me off guard. Most adults accepted any reference to Papa Will's educational activities without question, trusting his judgment implicitly. Mrs. Patterson seemed to be probing for more specific information. "Just practical skills," I said vaguely. "Mechanical things, mostly. He says I have a natural aptitude that should be developed." "I see." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me squirm. "Margaret, you know that if anything at all was making you uncomfortable or unhappy, you could talk to me about it, don't you?" The offer was genuine and tempting, but Papa Will's warnings echoed in my mind. What if she didn't believe me? What if she reported our conversation to him? What if my parents found out I had been telling tales about family business? "Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson," I said quickly. "I'm just adjusting to more advanced learning, that's all." She looked like she wanted to press further, but the school bell rang, signaling the end of recess. "All right, Margaret, but please remember what I said. My door is always open." As I walked back to my desk, I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. For just a moment, I wondered if Mrs. Patterson might be someone who could help me, someone who might believe the unbelievable and have the power to do something about it. But the moment passed, and I convinced myself that I had imagined her concern. After all, Papa Will's reputation was unassailable. Even if Mrs. Patterson suspected something was wrong, who would she tell? And who would believe her over the word of Millbrook's most beloved citizen? That weekend, I made my first serious attempt to resist Papa Will's escalating demands. When he informed my parents that I needed extra tutoring sessions on both Saturday and Sunday afternoons, I gathered courage to voice an objection. I was hoping to spend time with Carol this weekend. I said during Sunday dinner, my voice shaking slightly. We haven't been able to play together much lately because of all my extra lessons. Papa Will's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes meeting mine with warning intensity that only I could see. Education is more important than social activities, Maggie girl, he said smoothly. Besides, we're at a crucial stage in your development. Interrupting the learning process now would undermine all the progress we've made. But I miss spending time with friends my own age. I persisted, desperation giving me temporary boldness. Can't we skip just one session? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Papa Will set down his fork and fixed me with a stare that promised consequences for my defiance. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout Millbrook for decades. I'm disappointed in this attitude. After all the time and effort I've invested in your education, this is how you show your gratitude. Mama looked stricken at his obvious hurt. Oh, Maggie, how could you be so ungrateful? Papa Will has been so generous with his time, and you're acting like his instruction is some kind of burden. I'm sorry, I said, quickly recognizing that my resistance had backfired spectacularly. I didn't mean to sound ungrateful. I appreciate everything Papa Will does for me. I should hope so, Daddy added with stern disapproval. Not every girl your age is fortunate enough to receive such personal attention from someone with Papa Will's knowledge and experience. The conversation ended with my complete capitulation and Papa Will's satisfied smile. But something important had happened during that brief exchange. I had learned that direct resistance was not only futile, but dangerous. Any challenge to his authority would be reframed as ingratitude and disrespect, turning my own family against me. If I was going to fight back, I would need to be far more strategic about it. That night, alone in my room with Grandma Clara's journal, I read again her observations about the necessity of appearing compliant while secretly preparing for more effective resistance. Her words took on new meaning as I began to understand that survival sometimes required patience that felt indistinguishable from surrender. Theodore mistakes submission for consent. She had written, never understanding that a woman can appear to accept his dominance while secretly developing the strength and knowledge necessary to destroy it. The insight was revelatory. Maybe my apparent compliance wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strategic preparation for future action. Maybe the documentation I was beginning to create in my own diary, the knowledge I was acquiring about Papa Will's methods, and the psychological resilience I was developing were all weapons I could use when the time came for direct confrontation. But that time was still years away, and I was only 12 years old. For now, I had to focus on survival and preparation, trusting that the inherited strength Grandma Clara had recognized in me would eventually grow powerful enough to challenge Papa Will's seemingly absolute control. The education was continuing, but I was learning lessons he never intended to teach. Part 5. Secrets within secrets. The summer of 1954 brought a horrifying expansion of Papa Will's educational program. What had begun as occasional opportunistic abuse evolved into systematic violation with scheduled appointments that my family celebrated as evidence of his dedication to my intellectual development. 3 afternoons a week plus occasional weekend intensive sessions. Papa Will announced during one of his Sunday dinner presentations, speaking as if he were describing a prestigious academic program rather than planned child abuse. Maggie's showing such exceptional progress that I believe she's ready for advanced instruction in subjects most children her age couldn't possibly comprehend. Mama practically glowed with maternal pride. Isn't it wonderful how much individual attention you're giving her? Margaret is so fortunate to have such a dedicated teacher. The cruel irony of her gratitude was almost unbearable. My own mother was thanking my abuser for the systematic destruction of her daughter's childhood, seeing privilege where I experienced only terror. But it was during one of those expanded tutoring sessions that I made the discovery that would ultimately change everything. Papa Will had left me alone in his basement for a few minutes while he went upstairs to answer a telephone call, warning me not to move from where he had positioned me on his makeshift learning platform. For once, his arrogance worked against him. Confident in his psychological control over me, he hadn't considered that I might use his absence to explore areas of the basement I'd never seen before. That's when I noticed something odd about the wall behind his furnace. The paneling didn't quite match the rest of the basement, and there was a slight gap near the floor that suggested a hidden compartment. Remembering something from Grandma Clara's journal about Papa Will keeping insurance policies in secret locations, I worked up the courage to investigate. What I found behind that false panel made my blood run cold and my heart race with equal measure. There were photographs, dozens of them spanning decades, and featuring children I didn't recognize alongside a few familiar faces from our community. There were documents that appeared to be some kind of medical records, and most significantly, there was another collection of journals and personal items that had belonged to Grandma Clara. But these weren't the same kind of coded, careful entries I'd found in the journal Mama had given me. These were explicit, detailed, and devastating in their documentation of systematic abuse that had lasted for over 20 years. My hands shook as I opened the most recent volume dated from the months before Grandma Clara's death. The writing was weaker than in her earlier entries, obviously produced by someone whose physical strength was failing, but the content was brutally clear. Theodore's methods have become more sophisticated over the years. He no longer relies solely on physical intimidation. Psychological manipulation is far more effective for maintaining long-term control. The recordings he makes, the photographs he takes, the careful documentation of apparent consent, all designed to ensure that his victims become complicit in their own silence. Recordings. Photographs. The revelation that Papa Will had been using these techniques for decades, not just with me, made me dizzy with horror and recognition. He's preparing Margaret now. Continued another entry. I see all the signs, the way he watches her, the excuses he creates for private time, the gradual escalation of inappropriate contact disguised as grandfatherly affection. I want to warn her to prepare her somehow, but direct intervention would only accelerate his timeline and make her situation more dangerous. Grandma Clara had known exactly what was happening to me, had seen it coming years before it began, and had been powerless to prevent it directly. But she hadn't been entirely passive. The strength I've tried to cultivate in Margaret is her best hope for eventual liberation. Not the passive endurance that enabled my own survival, but active resistance powered by knowledge, documentation, and strategic thinking. I've left her tools she'll need, not just the surface journal where I hinted at truth, but these detailed records that will help her understand Theodore's methods and vulnerabilities. My heart pounded as I realized what she was telling me. The first journal hadn't been her only legacy, it had been breadcrumbs leading to this treasure trove of strategic information. The key to Margaret's puzzle lies in the music box. Read another entry. The song her mother hummed when she was small, the melody that unlocked my heart when Theodore first courted me. Inside that box is the number combination that will open Theodore's safe, where he keeps what he believes is insurance against exposure. But evidence cuts both ways. What protects predators can also convict them. A music box. I remembered seeing one in Grandma Clara's bedroom when I was small, though I hadn't thought about it in years. Had Mama kept it somewhere? Was it still in our house? The sound of Papa Will's footsteps on the basement stairs sent me into frantic motion, replacing everything exactly as I had found it and positioning myself where he expected me to be when he returned. But my mind was racing with new possibilities. "Sorry about that interruption, Maggie girl," he said as he descended the stairs. "Now, where were we in today's lesson?" As he resumed his violation of my body, I found myself observing his behavior with new, analytical detachment. Every technique he used, every psychological manipulation he employed, had been documented and analyzed in Grandma Clara's hidden journals. I understood now that his power over me was constructed rather than natural, systematic rather than inevitable. The knowledge didn't make the physical abuse less painful, but it fundamentally changed my psychological relationship to what was happening. Instead of being overwhelmed by helplessness, I was gathering intelligence. Instead of accepting his version of reality, I was comparing his behavior to patterns Grandma Clara had identified and documented. More importantly, I now knew that somewhere in Papa Will's basement was a safe containing evidence that could destroy him. Recordings, photographs, and documentation that he believed protected him but could actually be turned against him if they fell into the right hands. When the session was finally over and I returned home, my parents greeted me with their usual eager questions about my educational experience. "You look different today, sweetheart," Mama observed with the intuition that mothers develop about their children's moods. "More thoughtful somehow. Papa Will must be an excellent teacher. It was very educational," I replied truthfully. "I learned things I never knew before." What I had learned was that Papa Will's power over me wasn't absolute or permanent. What I had learned was that Grandma Clara had been preparing for this battle for decades, gathering intelligence and resources that she was passing down to me. What I had learned was that the psychological resilience she had recognized in me was real, measurable, and growing stronger every day. But most importantly, I had learned that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Even from beyond the grave, Grandma Clara was providing guidance, strategy, and hope for eventual victory. That night, I began searching our house for the music box she had mentioned. It took 3 days of careful investigation before I found it in the back of Mama's bedroom closet, wrapped in tissue paper and stored with other mementos from Grandma Clara's life. The melody it played was indeed familiar, a soft, haunting tune that Mama had hummed to me when I was very small. But more importantly, engraved inside the lid in numbers so small they were almost invisible, was what appeared to be a combination 072329. I memorized those numbers and began planning for the most dangerous part of my preparation. Somehow, I was going to have to find a way to access Papa Will's safe and discover what secrets he thought were protecting him. The inherited resilience Grandma Clara had recognized was finally strong enough to support more than just survival. It was time to begin gathering the evidence that would eventually destroy my destroyer. Part 6. The Music Box Clue. The discovery of Grandma Clara's music box felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, but acting on the information it contained would require patience, planning, and courage I wasn't sure I possessed. The combination 072329 was burned into my memory, but finding an opportunity to access Papa Will's basement safe seemed impossible when he controlled every moment of our time together. The answer came from an unexpected source: Papa Will's own arrogance. By the fall of 1954, he had become so confident in his psychological control over me that he began incorporating longer breaks into our tutoring sessions, leaving me alone in his basement while he attended to business calls or prepared what he called educational materials for future lessons. "Don't move from that spot, Maggie girl," he would warn before disappearing upstairs. "Papa Will has ways of knowing if his students are obedient when he's not watching." The threat was designed to keep me paralyzed with fear, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of cowering in place, I began using his absences to gather intelligence about his methods and vulnerabilities, just as Grandma Clara had advised in her hidden journals. The safe was exactly where she had indicated, behind the furnace, concealed by a panel that looked like part of the basement's original construction. The combination worked on my first attempt, the tumblers clicking into place with mechanical precision that seemed to echo through the silent basement. What I found inside confirmed my worst fears and provided my greatest hope simultaneously. There were dozens of recording tapes labeled with dates and initials, some going back decades. Photographs of children arranged in careful chronological order, documenting Papa Will's crimes with methodical precision. And most damaging of all, detailed journals where he had recorded his own analysis of his educational methods and their psychological effects on his victims. My hands shook as I read entries that described me in clinical terms as if I were a laboratory specimen rather than a human being. Subject MT shows excellent compliance after initial resistance phase. Recordings demonstrate clear vocal consent to educational activities. Psychological manipulation techniques proving highly effective. Subject now actively seeks approval for behaviors she initially resisted. Documentation should provide adequate protection against any future allegations. The cold, scientific language was almost worse than the physical abuse itself. Papa Will hadn't just been violating me. He had been studying me, analyzing my responses, and documenting what he believed was evidence of my willing participation in my own destruction. But Grandma Clara had been right about evidence cutting both ways. What Papa Will saw as insurance against exposure actually provided detailed proof of systematic child abuse spanning decades. His meticulous record-keeping meant to protect him could destroy him if it reached the right authorities. I couldn't remove anything from the safe without risking discovery. But I could study the contents during his absences and begin developing a comprehensive understanding of his methods and vulnerabilities. More importantly, I could identify other victims who might be willing to support accusations with their own testimony. One name appeared repeatedly in Papa Will's journals: Sarah Morrison, now Sarah Brennan after her marriage in 1950. According to his records, she had been one of his earliest victims subjected to the same educational program I was experiencing. But in the 1940s, when such things were even less likely to be believed or prosecuted, Mrs. Brennan still lived in Millbrook with her husband and 3 children. She was a member of our church, someone I saw every Sunday, but had never really talked to, beyond polite greetings. But Papa Will's journals revealed why she always seemed uncomfortable when he was around, why she never let her own children spend time alone with him despite his reputation as a wonderful grandfather figure. She knew. And if she knew, she might be willing to help me when the time came to expose the truth. But approaching Mrs. Brennan would require extraordinary care. If Papa Will discovered that I was making contact with his former victims, the consequences would be catastrophic. I needed to develop a strategy that would allow me to build trust and gather support without alerting him to what I was planning. The opportunity came through an unexpected source: the church youth group that Mama had been encouraging me to join as a way of making friends with children my own age. Mrs. Brennan was one of the adult supervisors, which meant I could spend time with her in a context that wouldn't raise suspicions. "I'd like to help with the church Christmas pageant," I told Mama one evening in November. "Mrs. Brennan is directing it, and she needs assistance to help with costumes and set decoration." The suggestion delighted Mama, who had been worried about my increasing social isolation. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. It will be good for you to spend time with other young people and learn from someone as accomplished as Mrs. Brennan." The pageant rehearsals provided perfect opportunities for casual conversation with Mrs. Brennan, though it took weeks to work up the courage to move beyond discussions of shepherd's robes and angel wings. The breakthrough came on a cold December afternoon when we were alone in the church basement, sorting through boxes of Christmas decorations that hadn't been used in years. Mrs. Brennan was examining a set of ornaments that had belonged to various church families, and I noticed her hands trembling slightly when she held one that I recognized from Papa Will's house. "That's a beautiful ornament," I said, carefully watching her reaction. "It looks like the ones Papa Will has on his Christmas tree." Mrs. Brennan's face went pale and she nearly dropped the delicate glass sphere. "Does it?" she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I wouldn't know. I don't visit the Thompson house anymore." The admission hung between us like a confession loaded with implications neither of us was ready to address directly, but it confirmed what I had suspected. Mrs. Brennan's avoidance of Papa Will wasn't casual or coincidental. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound innocently curious rather than strategically probing. Papa Will always says he misses the old days when more families would visit back and forth. She was quiet for so long, I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Some memories are better left undisturbed, Margaret. Some friendships change as people grow older and see things more clearly. The careful phrasing told me everything I needed to know without requiring her to say anything that could be used against her. Mrs. Brennan understood exactly what kind of man Papa Will really was, and she had been living with that knowledge for years. Sometimes I wish I could leave certain memories behind too, I said, matching her carefully coded language. But when you're still learning from someone, it's hard to put distance between yourself and experiences that make you uncomfortable. Mrs. Brennan's head snapped up, her eyes meeting mine with sudden sharp attention. For a moment, I saw recognition flash across her face, the look of someone who understands exactly what you're trying to say without being able to acknowledge it directly. Margaret, she said slowly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and barely controlled emotion. Is someone? Are there things happening that you can't talk about? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities and dangers. This was my chance to begin building the alliance that could eventually bring Papa Will down, but it was also my chance to destroy everything if I misjudged Mrs. Brennan's willingness to challenge Millbrook's most respected citizen. I don't know how to talk about some things, I said carefully, especially when they involve people everyone respects and trusts. Mrs. Brennan closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were filled with tears she was trying not to shed. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "How long has this been going on?" The compassion in her voice nearly broke my careful composure. For the first time in over 2 years, I was talking to an adult who might actually believe me, might actually understand what I was experiencing. "Since I was 11, I said quietly. "But I can't. I mean, who would believe something like that about someone like Papa Will?" "I would," she said with quiet conviction that sent hope flooding through my chest. "Because I was 15 when it started happening to me, and it continued until I got married and moved away from my parents' house. I've been carrying those secrets for almost 15 years, wondering if I was the only one, wondering if I should have found some way to stop him." The validation was overwhelming. I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't responsible for Papa Will's actions. Mrs. Brennan's testimony proved that his behavior followed established patterns, that other children had endured similar abuse and survived to tell about it. But more importantly, her admission meant I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. I had found an ally who understood exactly what I was facing and why it was so difficult to expose. "What do we do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure either of us was ready for the answer. "We plan," she said with determination that reminded me of Grandma Clara's strategic thinking. "We document everything we can remember. We identify other possible victims. And we prepare for the kind of fight that will require everything we have to win." The alliance was formed, the inherited resilience was growing stronger, and the foundation for Papa Will's eventual destruction was finally being laid. But I was still only 13 years old, still dependent on adults who worshipped the man who was systematically destroying me. The battle ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time since that horrible evening in June 1952, I believed victory might actually be possible. Part 7. Building the Case. The winter of 1954 marked the beginning of systematic preparation for what Mrs. Brennan and I came to think of as the reckoning. Our alliance had to remain completely secret, conducted through coded conversations during church activities and carefully planned encounters that wouldn't raise suspicions in our small community. "We need to be smarter than he is," Mrs. Brennan explained during one of our clandestine meetings in the church library. "Papa Will has had decades to perfect his methods and build his defenses. We need to develop strategies he won't anticipate." She had been thinking about this confrontation for years, she told me, but had never found the courage to act alone. My willingness to speak out had given her hope that justice might finally be possible, even against someone as seemingly untouchable as Papa Will. The key is documentation. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper, even though we were alone. Not just our memories, but physical evidence that can't be dismissed as fantasy or revenge. Things that prove a pattern of behavior spanning decades. I told her about Papa Will's safe and the evidence he had unknowingly provided against himself. Mrs. Brennan's eyes widened with possibilities as I described the recordings, photographs, and detailed journals documenting his crimes. "He always was too proud for his own good," she said with grim satisfaction. "His need to control and document everything will be his downfall. But accessing that evidence would require perfect timing and extraordinary courage. Papa Will's absences during our sessions were unpredictable and brief, never long enough to copy or remove significant amounts of material from his safe." "We need to create a longer absence," Mrs. Brennan said thoughtfully. "Something that will give you enough time to document what's in there without risking discovery." The opportunity came from an unexpected source: Papa Will's civic responsibilities. As volunteer fire chief, he was required to attend a regional emergency preparedness conference in Indianapolis, a day-long event that would take him away from Millbrook for nearly 12 hours. "This is our chance," Mrs. Brennan said when I told her about the conference. "But you'll need help. I can't go into his house without raising suspicions, but I can create a distraction that will ensure your parents don't worry about where you are during that time." She arranged for me to help with a church inventory project that would supposedly take all day, providing perfect cover for my real activities. Meanwhile, I had convinced my parents that Papa Will wanted me to organize some files in his basement office while he was away, a plausible story that played into their admiration for his dedication to my education. The morning of the conference, I watched from my bedroom window as Papa Will's car disappeared down our street headed for Indianapolis, and the most crucial opportunity I would have to gather evidence against him. My hands were shaking as I let myself into his house with the key he had given me for educational emergencies. The basement felt different when he wasn't there, less threatening, more like an ordinary workspace where terrible things happened, rather than a chamber of horrors specifically designed for abuse. The safe opened easily, with Grandma Clara's combination revealing the full scope of Papa Will's crimes in devastating detail. But instead of just studying the contents this time, I was prepared to copy them. Mrs. Brennan had provided a small camera borrowed from her husband, along with careful instructions about lighting and positioning for document photography. Working with methodical precision, I photographed every page of Papa Will's journals, every compromising photograph, every piece of evidence that proved his systematic abuse of children over decades. The process took nearly 4 hours, but when I finished, I had created a complete duplicate record of Papa Will's own documentation of his crimes. Evidence that he had collected to protect himself had been turned into evidence that would ultimately destroy him. But the most important discovery came in his most recent entries, where he had begun planning what he called the final phase of my education. Subject MT is approaching optimal development for transition to adult relationship status. Documentation now sufficient to ensure permanent compliance and silence. Recommend implementation of advanced psychological conditioning techniques to prepare for long-term association beyond family supervision. The clinical language couldn't disguise what he was planning. Papa Will intended our relationship to continue indefinitely, extending into my adult life through psychological manipulation and threats. I wasn't just his current victim, I was being groomed to be his permanent possession. The revelation filled me with rage and determination that burned away the last remnants of childhood fear. Papa Will had made a crucial mistake in underestimating my capacity for growth and resistance. He expected me to remain the helpless 11-year-old he had first victimized, never anticipating that I might develop into someone capable of challenging his control. That evening, I delivered the photographs to Mrs. Brennan during what appeared to be a routine visit to discuss church activities. Her reaction to seeing Papa Will's own documentation of his crimes was a mixture of vindication and horror. "This is more than enough," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But we need to be strategic about how we use it. Papa Will's reputation is so established that accusations alone won't be sufficient. We need a presentation that's so overwhelming, so comprehensive, that denial becomes impossible." Over the following weeks, we developed a plan that would maximize our chances of success while minimizing opportunities for Papa Will to mount an effective defense. Mrs. Brennan would approach other potential victims she had identified over the years, building a coalition of witnesses who could corroborate patterns of abuse. I would continue documenting Papa Will's current behavior, creating recent evidence to complement the historical record we had copied from his safe. But most importantly, we would choose our moment carefully, presenting our case when and where Papa Will's supporters would be forced to confront evidence they couldn't ignore or dismiss. The plan was dangerous and complicated, requiring perfect execution and extraordinary courage from everyone involved. But it was also our best hope for justice, and the only way to ensure that Papa Will's abuse would finally end. By spring of 1955, we were ready. Mrs. Brennan had identified 3 other women who were willing to testify about their experiences, creating a pattern of evidence spanning nearly 2 decades. I had accumulated dozens of photographs, recordings, and written documentation of Papa Will's current behavior. Most importantly, we had developed a strategy for disclosure that would make denial impossible, even for Papa Will's most devoted supporters. The inherited resilience Grandma Clara had recognized in me was finally strong enough to support direct action rather than just survival. The battle I had been preparing for since discovering her journals was about to begin, and I was armed with weapons Papa Will had unknowingly provided through his own arrogance and need for control. The time for silence was ending. The time for truth was about to arrive, and when it did, Papa Will's carefully constructed facade would crumble in the face of evidence that no reputation could withstand. Part 8. The Moment of Truth. Easter Sunday, 1955 dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring morning that should have been filled with hope and renewal. Instead, it would become the day when years of careful preparation finally converged into a moment of truth that would change everything for our family and our community. 23 relatives had gathered at our house for the traditional Easter dinner, creating exactly the kind of audience Mrs. Brennan and I had determined would be most effective for our revelation. Multiple witnesses, family members whose opinions mattered to Papa Will's reputation, and a setting where dramatic disclosures would have maximum impact while minimizing his opportunities for private damage control. I sat at our extended dining table, surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who saw only the beloved patriarch presiding over his family celebration. But I carried in my dress pocket a small envelope containing photographs that would shatter their comfortable assumptions about the man they all revered. The conversation naturally turned to my college plans with relatives, expressing pride in my academic achievements, while seeking Papa Will's wisdom about appropriate educational choices for a young woman. "Maggie's got such potential," Aunt Clara was saying, her voice warm with familial affection. "Though I must admit, I sometimes worry about sending her too far from family support." Papa Will smiled with the proprietary satisfaction I had learned to recognize and fear. His blue eyes found mine across the table with familiar possessive intensity as he prepared to demonstrate his control over my future. "Maggie knows where she belongs," he said with confident authority that made my stomach clench. "She understands the importance of family loyalty and keeping close to the people who truly care about her development." "Don't you, sweetheart?" The endearment whispered during countless assaults combined with his presumptuous confidence about controlling my future created a moment of crystalline rage that obliterated 3 years of careful self-control. My hands were trembling as I stood up from the table, but my voice was steady when I spoke. "Don't call me that," I said quietly, the words cutting through family conversation like broken glass. The room fell silent with the kind of shocked attention that follows unexpected disruption of social norms. Papa Will's expression shifted from confident authority to surprised concern, though his eyes carried warnings about consequences for public defiance. "Now, Maggie," he said with gentle reproof that everyone else heard as loving grandfather correcting an impertinent granddaughter. "There's no need to be disrespectful to Papa Will. I was just expressing pride in your accomplishments." "You don't get to be proud of me," I replied, feeling the inherited strength Grandma Clara had recognized, burning bright enough to illuminate every shadow Papa Will had created. "You don't get to call me sweetheart or pretend you care about my future when you've been destroying it systematically for the past 3 years." My parents looked confused and embarrassed by my apparent rudeness toward the family patriarch. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to behavior that violated every expectation about respectful family interaction. Margaret Rose Thompson. Mama interrupted sharply, her face flushed with mortification. "Apologize to your grandfather immediately. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this behavior is completely unacceptable." "I'm not apologizing," I said, my voice gaining power as suppressed truth demanded expression. "Not to him, not ever again." The declaration created uncomfortable silence as 23 relatives waited for explanation of my bizarre outburst. Papa Will maintained his mask of hurt confusion while subtly warning me with facial expressions to retreat before irreversible damage was done. "Tuh, this is about college decisions, isn't it?" Daddy said, trying to understand my rebellion in rational terms that wouldn't threaten anyone's fundamental assumptions about our family. "Honey, if you're upset about educational planning, we can discuss it privately after dinner." They were offering me an exit strategy, a way to reframe my defiance as teenage rebellion rather than revelation of dangerous family secrets. Part of me wanted to accept the interpretation and retreat to my room, preserving the status quo while avoiding catastrophic consequences. But Papa Will's expression had shifted again, revealing a flicker of triumph as he recognized the family's rush to normalize my behavior. He thought he had weathered my challenge successfully, that I would back down under pressure, as I always had before. The smugness in his eyes was gasoline on determination that had been building for 3 years. "It's not about college," I said clearly, looking directly at Papa Will for the first time in years without flinching away. "It's about what he's been doing to me since I was 11 years old." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and toxic, and impossible to ignore. Several relatives gasped audibly, while others leaned back as if physically recoiling from contamination of their comfortable assumptions. Papa Will's face went through rapid succession of expressions: surprise, panic, calculation, and finally wounded indignation that was perfectly calibrated to discredit my accusations, while positioning him as victim of unwarranted attack. "Margaret," he said, using my full name with authority that had once terrified me, "you're obviously upset about something, but making wild accusations won't solve anything. Perhaps you should go to your room until you can discuss this matter more rationally." "They're not wild accusations," I replied, reaching into my pocket for the envelope that contained evidence Papa Will didn't know I possessed. "They're documented facts about systematic child abuse that's been happening for 3 years. The word documented sent visible shock through Papa Will's composure. He hadn't expected me to possess evidence, hadn't anticipated that his own methods of control could be turned against him. "I don't know what kind of sick fantasies you've developed," Uncle Henry said, standing up abruptly from the table, "but I won't sit here and listen to you slander the finest man I've ever known." But Aunt Clara remained seated, studying Papa Will's face with intensity that suggested she was seeing something others missed. When our eyes met briefly, I caught a glimpse of recognition that sent hope shooting through my despair. "Ask her," I said, desperately pointing toward Aunt Clara. "Ask her about the times she tried to keep me away from him when I was little. She saw something was wrong, but couldn't name it." Aunt Clara went rigid, her face cycling through emotions as suppressed memories and half-acknowledged concerns rose to conscious awareness. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited for her response. She began, then stopped, looking around the table at family members whose opinions mattered to her social standing. I sometimes wondered, but I never thought. Papa Will would never. You did know? I pressed, moving closer to her chair with growing desperation. You saw how he looked at me, how he created opportunities to be alone with me? You tried to protect me, but couldn't say why because you didn't have words for what you were seeing. Her face crumpled as guilt overwhelmed her ability to maintain comfortable denial. Oh God, she whispered, covering her face with her hands. I should have said something. I should have found a way to protect you. Her breakdown created the first crack in the family's unified resistance, introducing the possibility that my accusations might contain truth they couldn't dismiss entirely. Papa Will recognized the shift and made a desperate attempt to regain control. Clara's been under tremendous stress lately, he said, quickly attempting damage control. She's not thinking clearly, just like Margaret. Sometimes emotional women imagine things that never happened, especially when they're looking for explanations for problems they can't understand. But the dismissal was too crude, too obviously manipulative for family members who were beginning to pay closer attention to the dynamics playing out before them. My cousin, David, Clara's son, stood up with an expression of growing anger. Are you saying my mother has been worried about this for years, but couldn't talk about it? That she's been carrying suspicions she was afraid to voice? His question shifted focus from my credibility to family dynamics that had allowed potential abuse to continue unchallenged, reframing the conversation in ways that acknowledged uncomfortable possibilities without requiring explicit acceptance of specific accusations. I tried to watch, Aunt Clara said through her tears, her voice breaking with years of suppressed guilt and concern. I tried to stay close when he was around her. But I couldn't be everywhere, and I couldn't prove anything, and I was afraid of what people would think if I was wrong about someone so respected. Her confession opened floodgates of recognition as other relatives began sharing their own suppressed concerns and half-remembered moments of unease about Papa Will's behavior with children. But Papa Will wasn't finished fighting. He made one final attempt at psychological control using techniques that had been devastatingly effective for 3 years. Margaret, honey, he said with a voice that shook slightly, betraying the first cracks in his confident facade. You're confused about what happened between us. Sometimes physical affection can be misunderstood by sensitive children, especially when they're going through difficult developmental phases. What you remember as inappropriate was just normal grandfatherly love that you've somehow distorted in your memory. The gaslighting technique that had once made me doubt my own perceptions finally met resistance strong enough to withstand its influence. No, I said with finality that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I know the difference between appropriate affection and sexual assault, and I have proof. I pulled the envelope from my pocket and placed it on the table where everyone could see it, my heart hammering so hard I was sure the sound must be audible to everyone present. These are photographs of Papa Will's own journals, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Detailed records he kept of what he called his educational methods with me and other children over the past 20 years. He documented everything because he thought it would protect him if anyone ever questioned his behavior. Papa Will's face went ashen as he realized the full scope of his exposure. The evidence he had collected as insurance against accusations had been turned into proof of systematic criminal behavior. You little bitch! He snarled, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. After everything I've done for this family, you want to destroy me with stolen documents and lies? The verbal assault was shocking in its viciousness, but it confirmed everything I had said about his true character. The transformation from beloved grandfather to dangerous predator was so complete and disturbing that even his strongest supporters couldn't deny its significance. The aftermath unfolded in chaos as family members processed revelations that would forever change their understanding of themselves, their family, and the community they had trusted to protect their children. But the battle I had been preparing for since discovering Grandma Clara's journals was finally won. Papa Will's power was broken, his secrets exposed, and his victims finally free to speak without fear of disbelief or retribution. The voice that had refused to be silenced had found its power at last. Part 9. Justice unfolds. The weeks following that Easter dinner transformed our quiet town of Millbrook into something unrecognizable. Word of Papa Will's exposure spread through our community like wildfire, dividing neighbors and friends into camps of belief and denial that would define our town's character for years to come. Sheriff Raymond Kowalski, Papa Will's longtime friend and weekly poker partner, found himself in the impossible position of investigating allegations against someone he had considered beyond reproach. But the evidence I had gathered, photographs of Papa Will's own journals, documentation spanning decades, and corroborating testimony from multiple victims made denial impossible, even for those most invested in his innocence. "Margaret, I want you to know that we're taking these allegations very seriously," Sheriff Kowalski told me during our formal interview at the police station. "The evidence you've provided is comprehensive, more thorough than we usually see in cases of this nature." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Papa Will's crimes in ways that shocked even those of us who had lived with knowledge of his true nature. Mrs. Brennan's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing patterns of behavior that stretched back nearly 2 decades and demonstrating that my experiences were part of a systematic campaign of abuse rather than isolated incidents. "He used exactly the same techniques 20 years ago," she told investigators, her voice shaking with long-suppressed emotion. "The recordings, the photographs, the psychological manipulation designed to make victims feel complicit in their own abuse, everything Margaret has described matches what he did to me when I was barely older than she is now." 2 other women from neighboring towns came forward with similar stories after news of the investigation spread beyond Millbrook's borders. Their courage in speaking out created overwhelming evidence of serial predatory behavior that made Papa Will's community standing irrelevant to criminal prosecution. The man who had seemed untouchable was suddenly facing charges that would destroy not just his reputation, but his freedom. Multiple counts of child sexual abuse, creation and possession of child pornography, and conspiracy to commit criminal acts against minors. The weight of evidence was so overwhelming that even Papa Will's expensive lawyers advised him to consider a plea bargain rather than risk a trial that would expose even more victims and evidence. My parents struggled with guilt so overwhelming it threatened their ability to function normally. The knowledge that they had unknowingly facilitated their daughter's systematic abuse had praised my abuser for his dedication to my education, and had dismissed signs of distress they should have recognized created shame that would require years of therapy to process. "We failed you in the most fundamental way parents can fail a child," Daddy said during one of our first honest conversations about the abuse, his voice breaking with emotion I had never seen him display before. "We were so blind to what was happening, so trusting of someone we should have questioned more carefully." Mama's guilt manifested in frantic attempts to understand how she could have missed signs of trauma that seemed obvious in retrospect. She read every book available about child abuse, attended workshops for parents of survivors, and consulted with experts who could help her comprehend the sophisticated methods predators used to maintain secrecy. The techniques he used were designed specifically to prevent detection. Dr. Margaret Hendricks, our family therapist, explained during one of our sessions. Child abusers like Papa Will are often pillars of their communities precisely because that reputation provides protection and access to victims. Your failure to recognize the abuse doesn't reflect inadequate parenting. It reflects the systematic deception of someone who had decades of experience manipulating families and communities. The community response was predictably divisive, but the weight of evidence eventually overwhelmed even Papa Will's most devoted defenders. The photographs of his own journals were particularly devastating because they demonstrated not just criminal behavior, but calculated planning and psychological analysis of his methods. I've been a prosecutor for 15 years. District Attorney William Morrison told reporters during a press conference about the case. I've never seen such comprehensive documentation of criminal behavior provided by the perpetrator himself. Mr. Thompson's own records will be the foundation of our case against him. The trial, when it finally took place in the fall of 1955, became a sensation that attracted attention from across the state. The contrast between Papa Will's public reputation and the evidence of his private crimes challenged every assumption about how predators looked and behaved. My testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and I delivered it with calm precision that impressed even experienced court officials. The 3 years I had spent preparing for this moment showed in every answer, every piece of evidence, every strategic response to defense attempts at discrediting my account. Margaret Thompson is one of the most prepared witnesses I've ever encountered, lead prosecutor James Sullivan said afterward. Her documentation was so thorough and her testimony so consistent that the defense couldn't find meaningful ways to challenge her credibility. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Brennan took the witness stand and described her own experiences with Papa Will 20 years earlier. Her testimony established patterns of behavior that corroborated every detail of my account, while demonstrating that Papa Will's crimes had been systematic rather than impulsive. He told me the same things he told Margaret. She said, her voice steady, despite the obvious emotional cost of public disclosure. That it was educational, that it was special, that it was our secret that would destroy our families if anyone found out. The psychological manipulation was identical because it worked. It kept us silent for decades. Papa Will was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison, an exceptionally harsh sentence for the 1950s that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the quality of evidence presented against him. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly pointed. Mr. Thompson, you used your position of respect and authority to systematically abuse children who trusted you. Your own documentation proves that this behavior was calculated, ongoing, and devastating to your victims. This court sentences you not just for your crimes, but for the betrayal of trust that made those crimes possible. But perhaps more important than legal justice was the personal healing that became possible once the truth was finally exposed and validated. Dr. Hendricks began working with our family to address the psychological damage caused by years of abuse and denial, helping us understand how trauma affects entire family systems rather than just immediate victims. Margaret's courage in speaking out has created opportunities for healing that extend far beyond her individual recovery. Dr. Hendricks explained to my parents. Breaking cycles of abuse requires exactly this kind of strategic disclosure, supported by careful documentation and community validation. The therapy sessions were difficult, but ultimately liberating, allowing me to process trauma that had been suppressed for years while developing healthy coping strategies for moving forward. More importantly, they helped my family understand how to support my recovery while rebuilding relationships damaged by years of secrecy and missed opportunities for protection. My college plans, which had seemed threatened by Papa Will's interference, were enthusiastically supported by parents who now understood the importance of geographical distance for healing. The full scholarship to Northwestern University became a symbol of freedom rather than abandonment, an opportunity for fresh start in an environment untainted by traumatic associations. You deserve every opportunity we can provide, Mama said during an emotional conversation about my academic future. This is your chance to build a life on your own terms, free from shadows that have defined too much of your childhood. The most meaningful aspect of my recovery was discovering how my survival could serve purposes beyond personal healing. Letters from other abuse survivors began arriving within months of Papa Will's conviction, creating a network of support and encouragement that demonstrated the broader impact of speaking truth about hidden crimes. Your courage in fighting back gave me hope that I could do the same, wrote Sarah, a 16-year-old from Ohio, whose grandfather had been abusing her for years. Reading about your case in the newspaper helped me understand that I wasn't alone, and that justice was possible even against people everyone respected. These connections reminded me daily that personal healing served broader purposes when channeled toward protecting other vulnerable children. The psychological resilience Grandma Clara had recognized in me was finally being used not just for survival, but for social justice that could prevent similar tragedies. As I prepared to leave for college in the fall of 1956, I reflected on the transformation that had begun with discovering her journals and culminated in Papa Will's conviction. The frightened 11-year-old who had first been assaulted in his garage had become someone capable of strategic thinking, careful planning, and effective action against seemingly impossible odds. The inherited strength hadn't been supernatural or mysterious. It had been the very human capacity for growth, resistance, and determination to transform suffering into purpose that served others facing similar challenges. Part 10. Legacy of Strength. 5 years have passed since that Easter dinner, when I found the courage to break my silence about Papa Will's abuse. As I sit in my dormitory room at Northwestern University, surrounded by psychology textbooks and research papers about trauma recovery, I can finally say with complete honesty that the inherited resilience Grandma Clara recognized in me has fulfilled its intended purpose. College proved to be transformative in ways that extended far beyond academic achievement. The geographical distance from Millbrook provided psychological space to process my experiences without constant reminders of trauma, while the intellectual challenges of university life channeled my analytical abilities toward constructive purposes. My academic performance exceeded all expectations as I threw myself into psychology courses that helped me understand the dynamics of abuse and recovery from both personal and clinical perspectives. Professors noticed my unusual insight into complex emotional themes, though few knew the source of my expertise. Your research on childhood trauma shows remarkable sophistication for an undergraduate, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison observed during my junior year. Have you considered specializing in this area for graduate work? The suggestion aligned perfectly with plans I had been developing since Papa Will's conviction. My personal experience with abuse had given me knowledge that could serve broader purposes if channeled toward helping other survivors and educating professionals about the realities of family violence. I think survivors have perspectives that academic research sometimes misses, I replied carefully. There might be value in bridging that gap between lived experience and clinical understanding. Dr. Morrison's encouragement led to independent research projects that would eventually become the foundation of my graduate work at University of Michigan, where I specialized in family trauma and child protection policies. The combination of personal experience and academic training created expertise that proved valuable to professionals working with abuse survivors. But the most meaningful aspect of my college years was discovering how my survival could inspire others facing similar challenges. Speaking engagements at conferences and workshops provided platforms for sharing insights about resistance and recovery that could only come from someone who had lived through systematic abuse and emerged with psychological integrity intact. Margaret Thompson represents something unique in our field, said Dr. James Sullivan, the prosecutor who had handled Papa Will's case during a conference on child protection in 1959. She demonstrates that survivors can become powerful advocates for change while maintaining the analytical objectivity necessary for effective policy development. The letters from other survivors continued arriving regularly, creating a network of support and encouragement that grew stronger with each person who found courage to speak out against their own abusers. Many credited my example with helping them understand that resistance was possible, even against seemingly impossible odds. You showed me that surviving abuse doesn't mean staying a victim forever, wrote Michael, a young man whose father had been molesting him for years. Your story proved that we can transform our pain into power that protects other children from similar experiences. Personal relationships had developed along parallel tracks as I learned to build intimate connections based on trust rather than trauma. Dating required careful navigation of emotional territory that remained sensitive, but the healing process had progressed far enough to allow genuine intimacy with people who understood my history without being defined by it. Marriage to David Richardson, a fellow psychology graduate student, represented a milestone of recovery that would have been impossible during the years when Papa Will's abuse distorted my understanding of male intentions and female worth. Our relationship was built on honest communication about past experiences and mutual commitment to supporting each other's continued growth and healing. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," David said on our wedding day in 1963, "not because you survived something terrible, but because you chose to transform that experience into something that helps other people." Children came later, 2 daughters who grew up knowing their worth, understanding their boundaries, and trusting their instincts about adults who made them uncomfortable. The parenting skills I developed drew heavily from understanding gained through surviving childhood trauma, while ensuring that cycles of abuse would end definitively with my generation. Mama always taught us that our bodies belonged to us. My eldest daughter, Emma, explained to her own children years later. She showed us that speaking up about problems was how we protected ourselves and other people who might be in danger. Professional recognition followed as my research about trauma recovery influenced policy changes in child protection services throughout the Midwest. The combination of lived experience and academic expertise provided credibility that purely theoretical research sometimes lacked, making my recommendations particularly influential with lawmakers and service providers. But the most meaningful recognition came from individual survivors who found hope through my example of resistance and recovery. My private practice, established in Chicago after completing graduate school, specialized in treating families affected by abuse, with particular focus on helping children find their voices when adults had failed to protect them. The office walls displayed my degrees and professional certifications, but more importantly, they contained artwork created by young survivors who had discovered that their experiences, however painful, did not define their ultimate worth or potential for meaningful lives. "Dr. Thompson helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't my fault," wrote Sarah, age 16, in a letter that sits framed on my desk. "She showed me that surviving abuse doesn't make you damaged, it makes you strong in ways other people can't understand. Now, I want to help other kids the way she helped me." Papa Will died in prison in 1967. 12 years into his sentence, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to a grave attended by fewer mourners than anyone might have predicted. His death brought more relief than sadness, closing a chapter that had defined too much of my youth while opening possibilities for complete emotional freedom. The investigation that followed my disclosure had indeed revealed other victims who found courage to speak out after decades of silence. The final count included 7 children across 3 decades, all of whom had endured similar patterns of abuse, while Papa Will maintained his reputation as a pillar of community virtue. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the change in how our community approached child protection. The shock of discovering that their most trusted citizen was a serial predator forced Millbrook to examine assumptions about reputation and respectability that had enabled Papa Will's crimes to continue undetected. New policies were implemented requiring background checks for adults working with children. Training programs were developed to help parents recognize signs of abuse, and reporting procedures were established that took children's allegations seriously, regardless of the accused person's social standing. "Margaret Thompson's courage changed how we think about child safety," said Police Chief Robert Henderson during a community meeting in 1968. "Her case taught us that predators often hide behind reputations of respectability, and that protecting children requires looking beyond surface appearances to examine actual behavior." The ripple effects extended far beyond our small town, as news of Papa Will's conviction influenced child protection policies throughout Indiana and neighboring states. The case became a model for how communities could respond effectively to allegations against respected figures when evidence supported criminal prosecution. Standing in my office today, surrounded by evidence of a life built from the ashes of childhood trauma, I can say with complete honesty that Grandma Clara's prediction was fulfilled beyond her wildest hopes. The inherited resilience she recognized has indeed burned bright enough to illuminate darkness, while proving that recovery from even the most devastating experiences is possible with support, determination, and strategic action. The voice that refused to be silenced has become a chorus of survivors, advocates, and protectors working together to ensure that no child has to carry such secrets alone. Every policy changed, every survivor encouraged, every family educated about recognizing and preventing abuse represents victory over the darkness Papa Will tried to create. But the greatest victory is personal. The knowledge that I survived not just Papa Will's abuse, but the aftermath of disclosure, the challenges of recovery, and the lifelong process of transforming trauma into wisdom that serves others facing similar battles. The 11-year-old girl who first screamed in Papa Will's garage could never have imagined the woman she would become, someone whose voice carries authority in courtrooms and conference halls, whose research influences policy and practice, whose example provides hope for survivors who might otherwise believe recovery is impossible. The fire Grandma Clara recognized wasn't just metaphorical. It was the literal determination to survive, resist, and ultimately triumph over forces that seemed overwhelming at the time, but proved vulnerable to sustained strategic resistance, powered by inherited strength that no predator could ultimately extinguish. This is my story, but it's also the story of every survivor who has found courage to speak truth about hidden crimes, every family that has chosen healing over denial, every community that has prioritized child safety over adult comfort. The voice that refused to be silenced has become eternal chorus that continues growing stronger with each person it touches, each life it transforms, each truth it illuminates. And in that chorus, Grandma Clara's wisdom lives on, transformed from private endurance into public commitment to justice that honors both her memory and my recovery. Her prediction that I would find my voice when it mattered most has been fulfilled in ways that continue protecting vulnerable children decades after her death. The inherited strength was real, powerful, and ultimately triumphant. The voice that refused to break has become song of hope that echoes through generations of survivors who now know that healing is possible, justice is achievable, and no secret is too dangerous to speak when the time comes to choose truth over silence.